Thank you for joining Advocates Coffee Talks, espresso-sized webinars for Advocates members. I'm your host, Sheila Godsey, National Manager of Member Engagement at Advocates, and helping in the background is Abir Sajjad, Member Engagement Associate at Advocates. If you've just joined, please note that all attendee mics are muted and video is off to ensure that there are no technical difficulties. If you have questions during the presentation, please hover your mouse on your screen and you'll see a Q&A button where you can type your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll make sure that all questions are answered before the end of this session. If you're joining us by phone, please email events@advocates.ca and tell us the phone number you joined from, first and last name, and Advocates ID. Our Zoom attendance report tells us how long each of you are on the webinar or call, and in order to receive seed credit, you must attend for the entire webinar. Today, we're speaking with Matt McGuire, co-founder and practice leader at the AML shop based out of Toronto. Matt will talk about the crimes money launderers are committing to generate wealth, the techniques they use to make it look like it's coming from legitimate sources, and the ways you can prevent, deter, and detect these folks. Advocates is your professional association, and I want to take a moment to thank our corporate partners and corporate sponsors for helping Advocates continue to build a strong community of financial advisors across Canada. But I want to start off with a poll. I'm going to bring up a question and ask you to choose the answer that suits you. It's anonymous and no one can see who answered, including me. So the question is, in the last 3 years, how many times have you experienced or observed suspicious or unusual transactions in your book of business? So it'll be interesting to see what the audience has to say about this. The answers are never, 1 to 3 times, or 3 or more times. So we'll give it another couple of seconds and we'll share the results. Okay, so it looks like great to hear that 90% of you never had anything suspicious or unusual. 1 to 3 times, that was 9% of the people, and 1% are 3 or more times. Very, very interesting, and I'm sure that, don't worry, no one can see who answered the poll. We're not collecting any data here, but it'll be interesting to see what Matt has to say about this. So I'm going to introduce our speaker now. Matt McGuire is an internationally recognized expert in anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, and sanctions. He's a forensic accountant that used to work as a FinTrack intelligence analyst, and he has been assisting financial institutions like Foresters, CPP, and Raymond James to assess and reduce financial crime and related regulatory risks for over 15 years. Take it away, Matt.
Great, thanks so much, Sheila. I'm really thrilled to be here. As a baseline, what I want to talk about is what is money laundering? So making sure that we're all on the same page. And money laundering in Canada is a different sort of concept than you might have seen on TV or in a movie. The point about money laundering in Canada is the offense is that if you knowingly deal with the proceeds of crime, if the crime was committed and it generated money, it could be drugs, it could be Ponzi scheme, it could be tax evasion, those proceeds are the proceeds of crime. And if you knowingly deal with them or recklessly deal with them, that's a money laundering offense. And so if you sold cocaine and bought a ham sandwich, that would be money laundering. So a little bit tongue-in-cheek, how many people will really understand this? Well, the world's 1%, as they say. You would have seen the Panama Papers in the news. Listen, and lately Canada's been heavily in the news. There's a whole commission of inquiry going on in BC about why money laundering is so rampant in Canada. You know, there are models of money laundering that have been named after Canada. Money laundering in some parts of the world that touch Canada it's called snow washing. The Vancouver model has been named after the region because of the prevalence of anonymous corporations and of money laundering in Canada. So terrorist financing is often talked about hand in hand with money laundering because they're so similar. When I say they're similar, I mean that we know in terrorist financing cases that the money they raise for their nefarious ends are often raised through illicit means. Kidnapping is a common way, opiate sales. And so money laundering and terrorist financing end up looking a lot alike in terms of their techniques. The real difference is the outcome, right? With money laundering, it's greed. We want the most profit out at the end of the other side that looks like it came from somewhere legitimate. With terrorist financing, we want to try to erase the trail for a different reason. We don't want to connect people with activities that are nefarious. I like to talk about Project SINDACATO, which happened last year in North Toronto. The mafia in Toronto is super strong and large and active. In fact, it was reported in the case of Project SINDACATO that the Italian mafia was largely controlled by the Canadian mafia. In this case, one cell of the Italian mafia was involved in illicit gaming. So they were running illicit gaming houses in North Toronto, and they had a companion offense, which was they were lending money at usurious rates. So criminal lending, loan sharking to the individuals who were gambling and getting into debt. They're using really fascinating ways to collect their money, particularly through real estate, forcing people to buy houses at inflated prices, forcing them to sell their houses at lesser prices, and anything in between. One of the other techniques they used was going to casinos themselves, illicit gamers going to casinos. Funny that, but they were gambling. They were coming in with $50,000 in cash a day. And on the news on CTV, when I was asked about why I thought this was such a bad idea, I don't like casinos as a means of money laundering, not in Canada anyhow. You're on camera from the moment you drive in the parking lot. They take a picture of your license plate. They get your information from that license plate. And then as you walk in, your face is shown. In some cases in casinos in Canada, there's visual recognition of your face and to your identity. And you're watched at every table. I don't think it's a great idea. I think it might have been the downfall of their scheme, but they were a very professional money laundering organization. Just to prove to you that happens in Canada, they had a lawyer, an accountant, a bookkeeper, a real estate firm, all within their fold to help them. In fact, they were so successful at this that they were able to open and operate 500 bank accounts across the country that were used for the purposes of laundering these funds. When eventually they were caught and the assets were seized, there was $1 million in cash, 27 homes worth $24 million, 23 cars worth $35 million, a $3,500 bottle of scotch, which in my opinion is $3,300 too expensive, and a rocket launcher. Yes, a rocket launcher. So I'm starting with good news stories because over time, since we started this initiative of trying to combat organized crime and transnational crime through money laundering, we're starting to get better at it. This is another example of a case where, you know, there was an international effort to take down a money laundering ring that originated from Iran, and it was running around the Toronto-Montreal corridor. They arrested 17 and seized $33 million. So how big is the problem of money laundering? I'm suggesting that it's a big problem, and I'm not the only one saying it. You don't have to take my word for it. The Cullen Commission, that commission of inquiry I mentioned in BC, actually found through professors that they hired that the amount can be estimated as much as $40 billion in a year in Canada. And other estimates range up to $130 billion. So it's a large problem, and it's dispersed across the provinces. So you might be here because you're thinking of a second career in money laundering because it seems so lucrative. Well, if you're taking notes right now, we're paying attention. But this is, if you're going to try to launder money, this is what's important to you. First is anonymity. That's at the heart of all good money laundering, is not being known for having done the thing that generated the proceeds, not being known for dealing with the funds. Try to separate yourself from the crime. That's the point. The more you can separate yourself from the crime, the less likely it is that you attract attention and your funds will be seized. The placement of cash used to be a really big thing in terms of money laundering. That's changed. The point is that the crimes that are committed are less violent than they used to be, are less related to drugs than they used to be. And so there's less physical cash to deal with. There's still some, but think about a Ponzi scheme, an identity theft. Any of these, the money's already in the system. You don't have to carry a big duffel bag full of cash anywhere. There are e-transfers, checks. Human trafficking is one of the biggest problems in Canada. Illicit prostitution, that's being done by email money transfers now. So you don't have that same problem, but you still have to be clandestine. You have to attract little scrutiny because taxmen get jealous, your neighbors get jealous, they blow the whistle, and there's a big problem. Speed is the next story. When I was an intelligence officer, it took 3 months to get information from country to country. Wires, cryptocurrency can be sent in a heartbeat. It's hard to follow. So you want that advantage of speed so you stay ahead of the game. Volume and value are hilariously difficult to achieve. And when I say hilarious, I'm thinking of the TV show Ozark. You know, he was trying to get rid of $8 million and started to understand that, you know, the next time it was going to be $50 million. And you might be able to get away with your first million. After that, it gets really difficult. It attracts a ton of attention. In his case, he tried taking over an entire town, which attracts a little too much attention. You need to be able to transfer the money internationally. Think about the idea that if you're trying to distance and you're trying to create the speed, and also that in Canada, methamphetamines, one of the biggest crimes that we're grappling with in terms of, you know, in Manitoba is really having a pervasive problem of methamphetamines. Vancouver too. That's how the Vancouver model was discovered, really, was laundering of meth, $20 bills, really difficult thing. And so the point is that all those precursors, all those drugs are often sourced from China and Hong Kong. You need to pay your suppliers. So you need to be able to transfer internationally. That's why crypto is being said to be one of the solutions. The last characteristic that's super important is that you have an alternative legitimate pedigree of the asset. So the point is that it has to look like it came from somewhere legitimate. This is why people say to me, well, why don't you just use a white label ATM? And that's a problem because I have to prove to the person that's challenging me where I got the cash from to feed the ATM. If instead I put a white label ATM in a fast food restaurant, I'm starting to get closer to having a better alternative explanation, right? I took the receipts from the day, I threw them in the machine, and people withdrew them. So how is money laundered practically in Canada? There's been lots of studies internationally and a few in Canada specifically about how people successfully launder money. Unfortunately, the studies are usually done of people that have been caught. And so they might not have the most sophisticated techniques, but these are the prevalent ones in any event. And concealment within business structures is probably the most important one to think about. When we think about money laundering, we think about commingling, running the money cash through a laundromat or a pizza joint. That's one of the most popular ways. You pay taxes on it, it attracts little attention, and you carry on. Misusing legitimate businesses like casinos was also common in the studies conducted. Nominees are really huge. This is what I find when I was doing the investigations for the Toronto Police Service, when I was you know, in the investigations that I've conducted, there's usually somebody who's the straw man, somebody who's put in place to appear legitimate, whose name the assets are in to shield the identity of the perpetrator. Exploiting international jurisdictional issues is huge. You can imagine, just by virtue of there being tax jurisdictions, tax secrecy jurisdictions around the world, that people would exploit those loopholes. Where the fence is lower, they're going to jump over it. As they say, you know, money launderers follow the path of least resistance. So, you know, in Mexico, it might be easier to deposit cash. So you bulk smuggle cash outside of, from Vancouver to Mexico. You wire it back through multiple jurisdictions. And then finally, use of anonymous asset types. So use of cryptocurrency, less anonymous than it used to be, but still fairly anonymous. Use of jewelry, gems, golds. Al-Qaeda used diamonds to launder its money. Easy to transport, internationally recognized standard of value, and you put it in the washing machine, it probably will make it. So what are the solutions? I've laid out a pretty big problem. It might sound like I'm being alarmist, but there are some very simple solutions. Have a look at this. And then where do the proceeds of crime come from? So what is the spectrum of crimes that are involved here? And so in 2015, the government of Canada actually put together a list of what they thought were the highest threats, and then down to the lowest threats. Capital market frauds was right at the top of the list. Corruption and bribery, illegal drug trafficking, third-party money laundering. Third-party money laundering is huge. And when we talk about mass marketing fraud, we're also talking about ransomware problems, right, which have become super pervasive. Human smuggling, human trafficking, identity theft. You can see many of these aren't cash-based. So the old view that, you know, you just back up a Brinks truck to your bank and get rid of your problem is a little outdated. So what about advisors? When we're thinking about the vulnerabilities associated with advisors, well, there's been studies on this as well. And the point is that you're very valuable people. You have incredible knowledge of the way the financial system works. You understand banking, you understand securities markets, you understand insurance, and intimately, what are the processes? And as much as clients want to consult with you for good, there are also some clients out there that will want to consult with you for evil. That is, that is okay, I'm back. Somebody was rudely called me on Zoom while we were in the middle of things and it all turned off. Sorry. So let me talk about the National Initiative to Combat Money Laundering. So Canada has put in place measures to be able to combat money laundering. The idea is that they believe that if we decreased the profit associated with crime, there would be less criminals, and specifically less organized crime. And the less organized crime there is, the more safe our communities are. This is the idea. And in fact, practically, the extent of violent crime in Canada is at its lowest rate in 30 years. And so perhaps this is part of that story. There are two aspects of how we deal with it. One is creating a hostile environment to money launderers. One is making it really difficult for them and awkward for them to be able to carry out transactions. We do that by identifying them, right? By asking questions about who they are and what they're doing. We want to diminish the possibility for anonymity. And we disclose their transactions to financial intelligence units to be able to increase that hostility. They're worried that that sort of thing is going to happen. The point that really hits home is then the sanctioning, the enforcement methods. The point is, we need investigators and police officers and prosecution and judges to swoop in and seize those assets and try to get them forfeited. Because the point is, we can put a lot of people in jail for money laundering, but if it's still profitable, more and more people will fill their seats. So we try to take the profit out of crime. What's our role? Our role is to maintain that hostile environment as advisors, as insurance professionals, as securities dealers, as folks who are advising people about their finances. Our point is to maintain the hostile environment, not for our clients, but for those that would exploit our knowledge. We need to maintain the integrity of the audit trail. The point is that there may be an investigation one day. If there is an investigation, your notes have to be great. Your records have to be good. You have to properly identify the people you're dealing with to make it possible for those investigations to take place. And finally, it's to provide financial intelligence to FINTRAC on suspicious transactions. That's their lifeblood. That's why we're complying. We're complying for intelligence. They use that information. They read every single suspicious transaction report manually that comes in to be able to see if there's linkage to bigger patterns. So what do we do in terms of compliance? Well, you'll know through your MGA or otherwise that there are some everyday things that you need to do. There are things that we put in place, structures to make sure that they happen. And then there are structures to make sure that those things are happening. So we do things like identify clients. We keep records of transactions. We look down to see who's the actual people behind the story. That could be the beneficial owner, controller, the director. It could be the third party, the person that's actually giving the instructions to the person who's sitting in front of you. It could be reporting suspicious transactions, reporting large cash transactions or wires. It could be about politically exposed foreign person determination. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. But generally, the legislation asks them and therefore you to manage money laundering risk generally. What do we put in place to do that? Well, every organization you'll deal with that's subject to the law is going to have a person in charge of compliance, a chief compliance officer, a chief anti-money laundering officers. They're going to put in place policies and procedures and training and a risk management plan. And they're going to insist on ongoing monitoring of relationships. So they're going to monitor relationships against what their past behavior was. They're going to monitor those relationships against indicators that we know look like money laundering. And then once every 2 years, they're required to undergo an AML audit. And so they might be talking to you about that to make sure that the training is effective. And then there's FINTRAC examinations. FINTRAC, the agency responsible for ensuring compliance, gets to conduct examinations to see that these things are working the way they're meant to. So if we get it wrong, FINTRAC has the power to issue a ticket. If a suspicious transaction report isn't reported, if something that's suspicious isn't reported, the penalty is $500,000. I've seen these where individuals just have a few unreported transactions and it could be $1 million penalty. There can also be a criminal proceeding. So FinTrack has the power against individuals to issue a criminal prosecution notice. So how do I know if a transaction is suspicious? How do I know if I should report it? Well, I know that it's expensive if I don't, so I should. So think about the presence of a third party most of all. So is there somebody behind the story? Are there indicators that somebody else is calling the shots? Am I getting emails from other people? Is somebody else showing up every time my client's showing up? Is the client attempting to pay cash for their transaction, right? So this is a very common thing where, you know, somebody will say that they had a cash, an inheritance, it's been sitting in their mattress, and they'll say to their broker advisor, listen, can you put it through your account and use a check to buy the ultimate good? That sort of thing is super suspicious. So there are cases, you know, I'm asked often, are there cases of this actually happening? And there certainly are. In this case, it was organized crime who got 5 nominees to go into the same securities dealer. Started with one, found out he could get away with it with one, that they came in with physical certificates that they deposited saying that the point was that they were going to hold on to them for a bit and then put them into blue chip stocks. They didn't do that. The moment they got in, they liquidated them, and then they asked for checks to be made out to third parties. So the first person started, and then 4 more people came along, having been referred by the same guy. So let's look at what the indicators are in this one based on what we've talked about today. Well, first of all, it's seemingly unrelated individual appearing and indicating that they're referred by the same guy. That seems like a dream. It can sometimes be a nightmare. The next is the unknown source of funds. That's the one that should really stick in your craw. The thing that might lead to your suspicion is, you know, they just don't understand how this person came to the wealth that they had. And you need to know that for a number of reasons, other suitability reasons. And then selling shares shortly after purpose contrary to their plan. This is why we monitor. We monitor against expectations. And then transactions being asked to be paid out to third parties. Listen, we're not acting like a bank here, right? The point is that we can pay it back out to the person whose name it's in, and they can use their own financial services company to pay it further so that it's monitored properly and there are controls in place. If you see this sort of unusual behavior, if you see the indicators, if you see those sorts of cases, keep calm, call your compliance officer. If law enforcement comes and asks you a question, you need to refer to your compliance officer. The processes will be laid out for you by them.
Thanks, Matt. I'm pretty sure that given the number of years you've been in the industry, you must have some very interesting and hair-raising stories to share about the cases that you've worked on. Is that right?
No question.
Okay, so now it's time for our last poll, and then we'll get to the Q&A. I'm going to bring up the question and ask you to choose answers that suit you. And again, it's anonymous and no one can see who answered. So here's the question. Which of these things are you planning to do to learn more about anti-money laundering in the future? Take more training, conduct an analysis of your practice, seek professional help, or do nothing. My MGA or company looks after everything. So let's give it a few more seconds here. And here's the results. So great, 71% need to take more training. 28% want to conduct an analysis of their practice. 2% are going to seek professional help, and 12% will do nothing. So that's really interesting, and it really does bring to mind some places where you might think that you have some vulnerabilities in your book of business. But we're going to carry on now, and here's your time to ask questions to Matt, and I'm going to just have a look and see what's come in. I have a really interesting question here. Can you explain smurfing?
Sure, yeah. So let me explain the pattern and then the origin of the name. So smurfing is the idea of breaking up transactions among people. So let's say $1 million fell off the Brinks truck and you wanted to use it without detection. Well, what you might do is go to 100 people and say, here, take your piece of it, go deposit it, and then write me a check for the amount less 5% commission, right? So it's breaking up transactions among people. It's called smurfing because when it first started, the idea was that it would be spread among many legitimate people, older people that wouldn't attract attention. Now, this is where it falls apart. It was about blue hair. Now, Smurfs don't actually have hair except Smurfette, and her hair isn't blue. So I don't know how that happened in the end.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Next question. I'm challenged with cryptocurrency clients because crypto is such a part of the dark web. I tend to assume that anyone that deals in crypto is on this money laundering scope. What do we do?
Oh, that is an excellent question. There are lots of legitimate people investing in cryptocurrency. I'm involved in a number of the enterprises myself, and I'm a cryptocurrency investigator. So the answer is that the beauty of crypto is that it leaves its own audit trail. And so it's really easy now to get a report in seconds that you know, if you have their wallet address, you can see exactly where they got their money and whether or not it came from an illicit source. You can see if it's touched the dark web. You can see if it's touched a bad exchange. You can even know which countries it's been run through. So I wouldn't start with the presumption that it's bad, but I would take measures to make sure that it's good.
Okay, next question. How about millions of dollars in offshore accounts recommended by their accountants? Is this money laundering or is it just wealthy tax evasion?
Well, tax evasion is a predicate offense to money laundering. So if you evade taxes, that's also the proceeds of crime. Still can't use it to buy a ham sandwich. But so it could be reportable. And so, you know, if you suspect that it's more than just tax structuring, right? We're allowed to structure our affairs to be able to pay the least amount of tax, but not evade taxes. And so the situation you talk about, when those sort of offshore jurisdictions are involved, you have to ask far more questions. There should be a due diligence process that leads you down a path of trying to determine the source and the use and the legitimacy of that system.
Okay, next question. What is the most common case of money laundering in Canada and where in Canada?
Yeah. So listen, the most pervasive money laundering right now is out of Vancouver. The Vancouver method is the one that I mentioned briefly. What they do is there's loan sharking to expatriates who go to casinos in BC. And so they take the $20 bills they earned by getting meth. They'll lend it to expatriates living in Canada and ask them to repay them in Hong Kong and China from their accounts there, rather than being paid in Canada, which would leave a trail. So that's one of the more common methods. As I mentioned, the other is commingling, just taking the proceeds of the crime and running it through what looks to be a legitimate business, like a law firm, like a pizza joint, this sort of thing.
Okay. Do you think cash value life insurance is being used by money launderers in Canada?
Yes, and not just theoretically, absolutely. Many life insurance policies, but many life insurance products carry virtually no risk at all. There's too much oversight. There's too little value. I've seen borrowing against cash value by money launderers. I've seen, you know, the free look period exploited. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. And last question. Oh, we just got a couple more, and we're not going to be able to get to everyone, but the last question here is, do you think, how do we deal with a client after we've suspected money laundering?
Yeah, awkward, right? So remember that the level for suspicion is really more than a hunch. That's been defined in law as being 11% to 35% certain. Filing a suspicious transaction report doesn't mean you have to not deal with the client. It means that you got to a point where you were suspicious of them. Let law enforcement deal with the client the rest of the way. My tag onto that is, if it happens over and over and you see that they're in the news, or there's something more than a hunch, something that gets you to like 50% certain, then, you know, start thinking about talking to law enforcement and not dealing with that client. What you don't want is the criminal code recklessness provision to kick in, right? That you are seen as a facilitator in some way of the transactions.
Okay, great. Okay, Matt, if anybody out there has more questions, we're going to post an email address where you can reach Matt at the end of the presentation. Many thanks to Matt McGuire of the AML Shop. That was an excellent overview of how and why money launderers go to such lengths to cover up their crimes and what advisors can do if they suspect it's happening on their watch. Now, if you're,
thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Matt. Take care. Now, if you're interested in this topic, please stay tuned for 3 new compliance courses that advocates will be launching in July of 2020. The 3 new CE courses are Marketing and Communication, Fact Finding and Know Your Client, and Know Your Product and Suitability. So look for that next month. Also stay tuned because on June 25th, we have our next coffee talk with Nick Colosimo, Associate Director of Government Relations at Advocates. Nick will be continuing with Advocacy Matters Part 2. Thank you for joining Coffee Talks today. After this presentation, we will send you a follow-up email that includes a recording of this session. For more information, please visit our website at www.advocates.ca. And if you want to reach Matt McGuire, it's matt@theamlshop.ca. If you want more information about Coffee Talks, please email events@advocates.ca. Thanks again and have a safe and happy day.